people talking, and you have to have a whole bunch of information. You have to get the people there, which is very hard. You have to make sure that people can get there. You usually need to provide them with some sort of food or incentive or something for doing that. There's a facilitator, you have to take notes. You usually want to record it. And then interviewing is the most resource intense, where you have to have a single interviewer. I don't think it's as hard to be a one-on-one interviewer. We're all very used to carrying on conversations with people, but you usually need to audio record it. It takes more of the people's time. If you transcribe it, it takes 4 times the amount of time to transcribe it as it does to have the interview to begin with. And then you have to go in and do some content analysis. And it can be very difficult to pull out your information. So you need to start with, well, how much can I invest in what it is that we're doing? Another thing that I think is really important when you start off thinking about surveys is to remember that surveys need to be tested and piloted, and that especially when you're starting your surveys, you should look at them and decide whether or not they're giving you the information that is most valuable to you, and then you should change them. And people are always saying to me, oh my gosh, but if we change them, how are we going to compare the data from year to year? And I'm like, yes, that is an issue, but would you rather be dealing with the fact that you have to change your data and talk about the fact that you're improving your survey methods, or would you rather have bad data for the rest of your life, right? So one thing that you can do is you can give the survey to your peers. You can give the survey to your partners or your kids. You can give the survey to a small group of people in your organization and ask them what they think. You can give the survey to your board. That process also involves buy-in and people understanding what it is that you're doing and asking questions. After you give that survey, you then take out questions that don't give you any meaningful information. Maybe everybody just said hi. Now, maybe that's important. Maybe as part of thinking about your outcome, you want to know that it's high, because that's what you want to be able to tell funders. Everybody thinks this is good. On the other hand, if everybody thinks that it's good all the time, it's not actually giving you any information. It's not helping you improve. You might need to reword questions that were misinterpreted. You might need to shorten the survey. I guarantee you, if you pilot it, you're going to shorten the survey. It is so painful, but you're going to shorten the survey. And you may add some additional questions. So think of the first year. Go and pilot it, but then think of the first pass of using your survey as an experiment pass. You'll get good information out of it. You can use that information, but it is the first time you're test driving it, and then you can change it and continue to develop your survey over time. All right, post. People really underestimate the value of post-tests without pre-tests. If you, and they're called tests, but they're not really tests, post-surveys. If you ask people how much knowledge they have before you give them the intervention and how much knowledge they have after the intervention, and you can do that in a meaningful way, then that can be really helpful. And you can look at the difference between their pre-information and their post-information, and you can say, people got this much information. One of the problems, though, is that the more information people come up in with, the less additional information they're going to have coming out. And it is very hard to ask people some of those questions about their internal experience. So when I did some work with the Jefferson Public Citizens Program, I think I told you this at UVA, and one of the things they want students to get out of that experience is more understanding and knowledge about human differences and perspective taking and disparities and power and privilege and all these kinds of things. Well, if you ask students before they even have a year-long experience overseas about how much basic cultural competency and proficiency they have, they're going to say a lot. And they probably are the more culturally competent and proficient students. Well, maybe not all on campus, but there are people who are interested in that. And then they come back and you say, how much cultural proficiency do you have now? And they go, a lot. But if you ask the students, how much did you learn over the course of the time? They say, a lot. Am I quoting Dick Cheney or something by saying, you don't know what you don't know, but you do know? I mean, If you don't know what you're missing, if you're asking people about their understanding of what they know, they overestimate it. And it's not just because they want to look good, it's because we overestimate what we know. I overestimate what I know all the time. I'm sure you guys do too, right? And so, and then when people come out of it, they go, yes, now I still know a lot. So unless you're asking them, what does FICA stand for? And they know it at the beginning, they don't know it at the beginning and they know it at the end, it doesn't make any sense to ask people like about their experience before and then look for their assessment of their experience after. It makes much more sense to say, how much did you learn? How much more culturally proficient do you feel now? How much more happy in your life do you feel now? How much more knowledge do you have about the diversity in the community? How much more secure do you feel in your food, right? And I say that important too, because if people who come to the food bank probably feel insecure about food when they come in and when they leave, on the whole, right? Because you're talking about people who are really struggling, but they may feel 100% less insecure. They're still struggling, but it's so much less of a struggle than it was when they came in. And your data is going to be more informative to you, and it's a better question to say, how much more stable do you feel? Or how much do you rely on the food bank for being able to get your food than it is to say, how stable do you feel now and how stable do you feel later? The other thing about stability is that, especially with those basic needs that we have of like food, shelter, safety, these kinds of things, unless all of that is taken care of, we do not feel safe in any of it, right? If you're really, really, really poor and you get a flat tire, everything is over, right? You can't get to work, now you're losing the day's pay, you can't afford to pay for your tire to get fixed now even more than you could before. Maybe your kid can't get to school. It takes you 3 or 4 days to figure out how to get resources to get everybody around. Your car never works again. Your whole life is different, right? If you have some money to be able to go and get that tire, it's just like, means you miss your morning meeting. Or in my case, that my husband comes and changes the tire and I go, and he drops me off where I need to go. Right? It's an inconvenience. It might even be a big inconvenience, but it's an inconvenience. It doesn't change your life. So when we're talking about providing people with these basic resources that a lot of you guys are providing, except for the art folks, you really, well, and you guys not either, you really need to think about the question that you're asking them and how it fits into the rest of their life. With you guys, it also is a very difficult question, because if you ask people who are bothering to come to art or bothering to learn about the Constitution, how much they are interested in the Constitution or interested in art, or how much they appreciate the history of the United States or something like that, you're preaching to the choir. Like, they're already there because they like what you have. So you need to ask them something about how much they've learned or how much it's enriched them beyond their current place. If you ask for a change in their experience, you're already getting people who are very high on the experience level, and you're only really providing them a tiny bit more information. We did this, and you guys in particular might enjoy talking to the Kluge-Roo. They were in the same class, and we talked all about surveying people at Kluge-Roo who come in and then experience Aboriginal art and what that means to them and how they can take it out. So we did an impact map with them and talked about their surveys, and that might be kind of helpful as far as developing a community practice. I've not done an art group yet, so we're just on our own. Questions or thoughts about post-tests and how to frame questions and why you might not want to do pre-post unless you're teaching people something very specific.
Does it make sense, like in a 2-hour workshop, say we're offering a welding workshop, to do the pre and post?
Oh yeah, it could. Now,
for such a short amount of time.
Well, presumably they learn stuff, right? The less complex it is, the better, right? I mean, I'm sort of thinking in welding, I'm like, okay, my brother's a welder. So I'm thinking, okay, so they come in, they're interested in welding, they don't know how to do it. When they leave, they've actually been welding, they know how to do it. It might be a little bit, we call it Barnum statements in research. It might just be kind of stupid, kind of self-evident, that they didn't come in knowing how to use a blowtorch and they left knowing how to use a blowtorch. So for the cost of the pretest, are you getting anything important out of the post-test? What might be better is to give them just a couple of questions at the end that said, you know, how proficient do you feel? Like, so here, we ask you guys how much you feel like you could take this information back. So instead of asking you how much you learned, we want to know how much it feels kind of accessible to you inside. So you could ask them, do you feel like you could do this on your own? Do you feel like, you know, you could go and do this somewhere else? Do you feel ready for the next class? All those kinds of things that assess their ability to internalize that information.
Well, I mean, like, I was just thinking about that, and for me, the 2-hour thing is so short, it's like you're almost just exposing someone to something, making them feel confident that they might then take another step to do more in the future. And
confidence and competence are two big things that you're trying to get people to have. You're not trying to get them to have mastery, right? Over time, they have mastery, but you have competence and confidence. Do you feel like you know how to do this? Are you sure of the steps? Do you feel like you could take this forward? And then over time, oh, impact map is gone. Longer term impact is, do you feel like you have mastery?
I took a half-day metalsmithing class. I had a torch for a year and didn't turn it on until after I took that class, and I felt like I
Exactly.
afterwards.
Have you used it since?
Oh, yes. I've now progressed.
Awesome! Long-term impact! Any other questions? All right. Highly devalued part of your survey, but very, very important. What are you doing and why? And who are you? And how can people ask questions? This does not and should not be 5 paragraphs. This is like 2 sentences and a phone number. But if you don't give people an anchoring into what it is that you want and how you're going to use the information, they literally cannot answer. It's too broad. Let me give you an example. This is my favorite example. You've heard me talk before. You all have heard me before I say it. A couple of years ago, the city schools sent out a survey to all the parents that said, would you be in favor of an extended school day? And they had a whole bunch of different questions that they were asking basically about this. And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, I'm someone who believes that kids should be in school from like 8 to 6, 365 days a year. I mean, I think that it's just, I think soapbox, homework is a disparity place. It's where people don't have equal access to resources. It increases the gap. But kids do need to learn to work independently. So what you should do is you should give them independent work time at school. I also believe kids should be able to move around and talk and have fun. So I'm like, yes, put the kids in school more. Summer break is a mess, right? Just put them in school all the time. But I'm like, but what are you going to do with the extra 30 minutes or 40 minutes that you're asking me for? What are you going to do? Are you going to grill my kid more on math without giving them more than 15 minutes or 20 minutes of playtime? Are you going to pay the teachers more? Is it going to result in higher taxes? I don't know. I couldn't answer the question. I had to say no, even though I so believe in extended school days. So just by coincidence, I was at a birthday party for one of the school board members, like a month later, and I was like, I gotta tell you about the survey. It's a bad survey. And she goes, oh man, everybody said that they were against it. And I said, yes, I said I'm against it, but I am so for it. But I didn't know how you were gonna use the information. It didn't say, we just want to poll parents and find out if in general, all else being equal, if we had a longer school day, would you be against it in principle? Is it worth us opening up the conversation? In which case I would have said yes as many times as they let me. If they're asking me whether or not I think that my kid should have 5 minutes added to every single class that she's taking, I would say no, right? If they asked me whether or not I thought that she should have 10 more minutes of math and 15 more minutes of playtime, I would have said yes, right? So there needs to be some context for what you're asking. It also makes people feel safer because they know how their information is going to be used. And it also lets them know what opportunity for empowerment are you offering. I actually don't like to use the word empowerment because to me it implies that I have the power and I'm giving it to you. And really you already have power. What I'm doing is usurping your space. So what space am I opening up for your power to be in there in order to say your piece and be an active part of the development of my program? So do this. All right. These are general guidelines for wording your survey. You should have it at a 6th grade reading level, and in Word, they have a reading level tracker. I always mean to have it written out how to get there, but it's somewhere in like grammar and spelling and stuff like that. Dana's found it in the past. I'm sure somebody will find it in the next over break and share it with you guys, but it's there. You can Google it. It is highly based on not only word complexity, but sentence length and parenthetical phrases. You want to limit parenthetical phrases. I love parenthetical phrases personally, and I love tangents. I do them all the time, but you don't want them in your survey. You want to be clear and concise, and you want to be concrete. You want to ask them a specific question. You don't want to ask them how they feel. You want to ask them how happy they are, right? And you want to not be complex. I guarantee tomorrow or next session when we come together, somebody's going to be in here going, oh my God, how do I ask them if they got anything out of the class? I'm going to say, well, you ask them if they got anything out of the class. Because we get this idea that we need to come up with some sort of fancy word or complicated way of describing all the different pieces of what we're thinking, and we don't. You just need to ask them the question. But you need to ask them the question in a way that is concrete and simple. We'll show you some examples. The first thing you need, I love this. So aside from being clear and concrete, you also just need to ask one question. You cannot ask people how helpful or useful the information was. You can't ask them how satisfied and happy they were with the programming. You can't ask them whether students and teachers like cafeteria food. You have to ask one question at a time. When you go and start looking at surveys, you will be astounded at how many people ask more than one question. How helpful or important? You also need to think about, and actually this really shouldn't have an X, but you should think about whether you want closed-ended or scaled questions. Sometimes you want yes/no questions. Do you like eggs? Do you eat eggs every day? Right? And you're going to get a very different answer than if you ask people on a scale, how do you feel about eggs and how often do you eat eggs? In this one, if people don't eat eggs every day, they're going to say no. In this one, you're going to find out how many people eat eggs 5 to 6 times a week. And it may not matter to you. It's fine. But there's a big difference between closed and scaled questions. Another thing you'll notice, probably looking at your own survey, is how many times you say, do you eat eggs every day, and then you give them a scale. You can't do that. This is a yes/no question, this is a scaled question, but people do it all the time. You ask people a yes/no question, are you satisfied with the class? And it goes, very dissatisfied, neutral, very satisfied, right? It sort of fits, but it's really not the question you're asking. You just need to say, how satisfied are you, as opposed to, were you satisfied? But you need to pay attention. You'll see this everywhere. The other thing that you want to make sure that you ask them is not how satisfied are you, how satisfied were you with the class, but how satisfied or dissatisfied or satisfied were you with the class. So if you ask how great of a player was Michael Jordan, you could get not great, But it would be better if you said, what kind of player was Michael Jordan? And your scale was not great to really great. You truncate one side of your opportunities for questions. Now sometimes you don't need the other side. So if you're asking how much you learned, you don't need to know how much you lost, right? But if you're asking how great someone is, you really want to be able to say average, not great, average, great. You don't want the scale to be not great or average to great. You also don't want to have them compare people in a scaled kind of survey. You can have them doing ranking and other kinds of things, but you don't want to say how much better of a player is Michael Jordan than Larry Bird, because maybe Larry Bird's a better player than Michael Jordan. Anyone in here know who Michael Jordan and Larry Bird are, by the way? Okay, I always check, because one day I'm going to have to change this to people I don't know. Okay. You also want to avoid assumptions, like here, how does the new website compare to the old? What if they don't know about the old? What if they don't care about the old? You really want to know how would they rate the new website. You also don't want to have them compare here, how was your shopping experience? Okay, let's talk about scales. That's really basically it for wording. There is an entire science. You can get a PhD in survey development or quantitative psychology or sociology or public health or whatever in scale construction. Scale construction and how people respond to scales is very, very important. All the pollsters know this. They change the questions in the scales to make sure that people answer them. I'm going to give you just some of the brief, most important things that are going to relate to you and how you may want to develop scales. This kind of scale is called a Likert scale. I think it's because some guy named Likert wrote a paper on it and said, here's a really good way of using a scale. Your scale can have yes, no. Your scale can have 4 points. Your scale can have 10 points. Your scale can have an odd number of items. Your scale can have an even number of items. We're going to look at a bunch of different ways of wording scales, but the space between your items needs to be the same. So if you say, this is kind of a funny spaced question. This space is kind of smallish. This space is really big. And this space is really pretty small. Right? So when people are answering this, it's not even for them in answering it. You're missing a whole bunch of people. You're lumping together all the people in between sometimes. And quite often, you're forcing them into sort of extremes. So the space between your responses needs to be similar. You also need to decide whether or not you want a middle anchor or not, right? So here, this is, half and half. And here, this is bad, less good, and good. It eliminates the middle item. I have a very strong bias to using 4 or 6 point scales because what I find is that when you give people the middle option, they use the middle option and you get no information, right? If you force people to say it's good or it's bad, then they're really weighing whether or not it's good or bad, and if they're really in the middle, they'll go here, they'll put a little X there, and everybody knows the people who put little X's in the middle. or they're gonna go one side to the other. If they put an X in the middle, all you need is a rule for what you do when people put an X in the middle. And you can either say that as a rule in my organization, every time there's an X in the middle, we're gonna make it good, or every time there's an X in the middle, we're gonna make it bad, and then you're fine. Okay? Which the people filling out the survey would be so mad about. But you wanna use the data.
Could you also just throw it out? Or
You could decide to throw it out. You could totally decide to throw it out, I guess it depends. The other thing about this is a lot easier to report. So if you have 100% of people, right, and here you've got 30% of your respondents, and here you've got 40% of your respondents, and here you've got 30% of your respondents, when you go out into the world, you're gonna say that 40% of your people liked it a lot. And that's going to imply that 60% of your people didn't, which is actually not so good, right? Here, you might get 60% and 40%, if that makes sense. And so instead of having to have 4 sentences about this scale, you can have just basically 1 sentence. You only have to present 1 number here, because the other one is self-evident. So I find this is easier to communicate. I find that it gives you more useful information. You can deal with the people who have to have the middle point by dropping them out or moving them to one place or another. And you avoid all these wishy-washy folks in the middle. Anyone in here a wishy-washy folk in the middle?
On occasion. Maybe because they don't ask the right question.
That's exactly right. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you pay attention to the congruence of the ends of your scale. So if you have all, not at all here, and you have really great over here, that's not the same continuum. And in research too, in academia, there have been weeks and weeks spent trying to figure out how to get the scale congruent. And sometimes you're not, usually what it means is you're not asking the right question. You need to ask something different if you can't get your scale to match up for yourself. So let's look at some examples. What is wrong with this?
It's not congruent.
Not congruent. Well, could be congruent if you ask the right question, but yeah, it's not great. What else?
I think being specific, mostly and fully to me are confusing. It's almost like it's the same thing.
Yeah, the space here is really tiny. The space here is really big, right?
But you're saying mostly and fully sound too much the same.
Yeah. And not at all, and minimally is pretty similar too, right? There's really no like sometimes. What about here? What's wrong with this scale?
Average doesn't fit.
Yeah, it's not the right word. It should be sometimes, right? What about this?
Like and agree are not the same.
Yeah, they're not the same. Now, when you're writing the question, couldn't you see how you might put this in there? I mean, you totally could, right?
Probably seen
And you've probably seen it before, but it actually doesn't make sense. And the more you confuse people, the harder it is for them to answer your survey.
So where's a quick question before we go too far on, back to the middle point and not
Yes.
the middle point. So in our evaluation form, last year, we had one, the 10-point line, and so we had a middle point. And we found that everybody went to the middle, a lot of people went to the middle point.
Even on a visual analog scale, which
Yeah.
we're going to teach you guys about in a minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
So should I do that as, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10?
So what Barbara is saying is that when they review grants, they ask people a question, they ask the reviewers a question, and it goes from no to yes. And this is 100 millimeters or 10 centimeters, depending on how fine-grained you want to measure it. And she's saying that everybody ended up putting it like this. And so now restate your question, say your question.
So how do I,
How do you do that?
yeah, do it, do we change that to discourage that middle point? Now, we did have a word above it.
Above the middle point?
Yeah, what did we say? So we'll take that out.
Take out the word,
Yeah,
yes, there
I
should
think
not be a
it
word in the
was,
middle.
and so what, oh, I know, discuss was the word.
So what I would do is I would put discuss. Yeah, no, yes. So then what they're doing is, you know, this is should we fund, right? And they would rate it no, yes, and then do you want to discuss? Yes, no, yes. And that way, this is free of whether, you know, because if they're putting it in the middle, what they're saying is, I don't know. They're using it as an I don't know. But what you want them to do, and actually should we fund is not, that's not the best one to put here. But what if we say, does this meet a clear community need? I think you guys have a question on there that's similar to that. This one is a better one to show how this would work, right? Because if they go middle, they're basically saying, I don't know. But if they're able to rate here whether or not it meets a community need, and then they're able to say, yes, I want to discuss it, those will be more independent and they'll use the scale better.
So between the no and the yes, there's no other divisions, it's just you stick it wherever you want.
And this is a long story because we have reviewers who are very analytical and want that to be 0 to 10. Then we have people who want to feel good and don't want to be so analytical that they have to establish a score. But we transfer that mathematically to create bubble graphs, to be able to create a
Which
visual
will show you bubble
display for
graphs.
discussion purposes.
So what's nice about these visual analog scales is that people can just sort of write a feeling between two extremes. So if this was strongly disagree, strongly agree. So all of these are different ways of doing this, and it makes it just continuous. They use this for pain. We're going to talk about it in a minute. Well, we won't talk about it in a minute because we're talking about it now. But you'll see the graph. You'll see the little picture of it in a little bit. And what it does is it just gives people, they can mark anywhere they want on the line. And if it's 100 millimeters, you measure it, and then you can get a score that's like, you know, 35, 52. And so you both have people being able to use it as a scale that's impressionistic, and if you want to, you can get a number out of it. A lot of the online survey things call this a slider, and they just measure it for you. So people just slide the little bar over and you get an answer. It's really great. The issue though is that it's a little hard sometimes to describe. In the grant making process, it's great because then all of what you can do is you can write a little graph from no to yes, and you can have reviewer 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can just plot on there. And that way the reviewers, without a number,